Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life. For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at www.veritas.org. The following material is copyrighted and may not be duplicated, reproduced, or redistributed without prior written consent from the Veritas Forum. Join us as we explore true life.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Cy, for those warm words. I am here tonight because of Cy. Summer before last, he was an intern for me in our ministry, and I developed a great respect for him and a great affection for him. And so while I've had to curtail a lot of my trips to campuses like this, though I love the opportunity to do it, when Cy asked me, I really couldn't turn him down. Plus, his father's on my board of directors, so I work for him in a sense. But I'm delighted with this opportunity. You know, coming up on the plane this morning when Cy was talking about my background, coming up on the plane this morning, I saw a woman was sitting there reading, and she saw me come on, and she got up out of her chair, and she came over and said, "Oh, Mr. Colson, your books are so wonderful." She said, "I really appreciate them." She said, "My son is reading about you right now. Would you sign this little card so I can put it in his book?" I said, "Well, I've written 20 books. Which one of mine is he reading?" She said, "No, it's not one of yours. It's the history book." So I'm not sure whether I'm here tonight as a speaker or an artifact of modern history, but you can take me either way. I'm going to do my very, very best to be as brief as I can with these remarks. First of all, I don't like standing this far from you, but this is where they told me the podium has to be. And secondly, I know there's a debate at 9 o'clock, and if you do get up and leave, go ahead. I'll just stop and stare at you. I don't know why you'd want to, frankly, because judging by the first two debates, this one will surely put you to sleep. At least the first two did with me. But I also want to leave as much time as possible for questions, because I love Q&A. I'd like to get right by the lecture part of this and get into the Q&A. But I think if I tell you a little bit about myself and a little bit about what I do now and why I do it, that it may give you a better basis for the questions and answers that I hope will elicit from this crowd. Let me say that I believe that life is a great paradox. A number of years ago, I was in Australia, given the opportunity to speak live, broadcast to the whole nation at the National Press Club in Canberra. And it was a half hour of grueling questions from the press after I'd given a half-hour talk. It got right to the end, and this last person, I remember him standing up saying, it was from an Adelaide newspaper, and he stood up and he said, "Mr. Colson, you've one of the most fascinating lives I've ever seen." He said, "You've lived two lives." He said, "Can you sum up what your life stands for, or what, maybe you could give us just a word or two about the meaning of your life?" And I looked at the clock, and there were 20 seconds before we went off live air. I said, "The only thing I can tell you is what Jesus told his disciples, and that is, he who seeks to save his life will lose it. He who loses his life for my sake will find it." And that's the story of my life. With that, we went off the air at just exact time. And I'm sure people all over Australia were thinking, these crazy Yankees, they come down under and talk to us in riddles. But literally, that is the story of my life. As Cy was giving you some of the descriptions, my early years, I was the first person in my family who would go to college. I thought if I could get to college, and I won a scholarship to Brown University, and when I got through there, it was time for me to go into the military because the Korean War was raging, and so I became a lieutenant in the Marines and rose very rapidly. I'd won honors in school. I think everything I ever did in my life I was successful at. I went to law school nights while I was working as an assistant to a United States Senator. At one point, Newsweek wrote about me as the youngest administrative assistant to a United States Senator. I think I was 28. And ran campaigns, loved it, started a law firm, great success. Got to know Richard Nixon. In 1968, when he was elected president, he asked me to come. I was, at that point, left a law practice, which was making a lot of money, and went into his administration as his special counsel. I had kind of an open portfolio. I was the guy that advised him on lots of the political things. It was a very exciting thing because I arrived in his office when I was 38 years old, and my office was immediately next door to his. And so I was with him and in and out of his office every day. That's a pretty heady business. And, you go to the 8 o'clock senior staff meetings, there would be 12 of us sitting around the table in something called the Roosevelt Room. It may have been named for Franklin Roosevelt, but those of us who were Republicans said it was named for Teddy. And the 12 senior aides would come in with their big portfolios under their arm, and Henry Kissinger would always be the last one to arrive. And he would sit down at the end of the table and he'd say, "Mr. President, the decision we are going to make today is going to change the whole future course of human history." I mean, every day of the week for 5 days. That gets pretty exhausting. And we thought we really were doing things that were of great significance, and in many respects, I suppose, looking back, they were. When the campaign was over, and I'd pretty well run the campaign for President Nixon in 1972, I decided to go back to my law firm. But I was feeling sort of jubilant over what was at that point the largest landslide victory in American politics. Instead of being jubilant over it, I was feeling kind of down. 41 years old, I'd been there, I'd done that. There wasn't much else left to do. And I can remember looking out over the south lawn of the White House, the beautifully manicured lawns, looking from my office at that beautiful picture, and thinking to myself, my grandfather, who was an immigrant to this country from Sweden, would be so proud to see his son in a place like this, but what am I really doing here? What's my life about? I started asking a lot of questions. I went through a period where I thought I was just kind of maybe battle weary after being in the White House, and phones, calls in the middle of the night, and emergencies one after another, and you're kind of stressed. And so I figured maybe I just needed a rest, and I got some rest. Watergate was just rearing its ugly head at that point, and I was getting ready to leave the White House. Took a couple of trips abroad, but I came back and I still had that emptiness. And one day I was back in my law firm, and I went to visit a client whom I had not seen in the 4 years I'd been in the White House because I refused to see anyone I'd ever practiced law as their lawyer. I was so worried about a conflict of interest. Can you imagine that? And I went to prison. But I went back to see one of these men, Tom Phillips, who was the president of the largest corporation in New England. I'd been his general counsel. I walked in his office one day and still feeling kind of empty. And I looked at him, and he was a completely different guy. He was a guy like myself who'd worked his way up the hard way, self-made man, became head CEO of this corporation when he was barely 40 years old. Dynamic guy. And he was at peace, and he started asking me about my family. And finally I said to him, "Tom, you've changed since I saw you 4 years ago." He said, "Yes, I have, Chuck." And then he looked up at the clock, and he didn't look me straight in the eye, but he said, "I have accepted Jesus Christ and committed my life to him." Now, I got to tell you, good people, I took a firm grip on the bottom of my chair. I'd never heard anyone talk like that. I grew up in that vast Unitarian wasteland of New England. I never heard the gospel. I never heard anybody talk about Christ as a person. I'd gone to Sunday school and learned all the lessons you learn in Sunday school, but it didn't mean anything to me. He looked away, as I later found out, because he'd never done this with anyone before. Kind of interesting. I thought about that for the next 3 months, and I couldn't get it out of my mind. And so I went back to him one evening in August of 1973, and I said, "Tom, you got to explain this to me." And he said, "Before I do, I want to read you a chapter from a book, a chapter I'd recommend for all of you, particularly because you're type A, high achievers. You wouldn't be at Columbia or otherwise." And he read to me the chapter from C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity entitled "The Great Vice, the Great Sin, Pride." Proud man is always looking through life, looking down on other people and things, and therefore can't see something above himself, immeasurably superior, God. I listened to this chapter, and C.S. Lewis, if you know him, the Oxford dean, who was a great Christian apologist, as well as a great professor of medieval literature, I listened to that and I realized he's writing about me. I thought I'd done all these good things because I wanted to serve my country and I wanted to be a success at my profession, and it was really all about me. And I sat there that night in pain listening to that chapter read. And then Tom told me how he'd gone forward at a crusade here in New York with Billy Graham preaching and given his life to Christ. And I was really moved. He wanted to pray with me, and I said, no, I'd never prayed except in a church, so he prayed. I left his home that night, and here I was, a former Marine captain, and yeah, I was known as the White House Hatchet man, the tough guy. That wasn't very good when my book came out in Germany, and they translated Hatchet man, and I noticed after they translated my book, Chuck Colson, the White House Hatchet man, that they'd translated it in German, Chuck Colson, the White House executioner. I didn't win many audiences when I went to Germany with my book when it was translated there. But that night he told me of his own experience when he gave his life to Christ. And here I was, the tough guy, and I don't think I'd ever cried or I'd let anyone know if I did. I left his home that night. I looked back and I got into the automobile and I tried to drive away, but I could not because the tough guy was crying too hard. I couldn't see the road in front of me. I pulled over and sat there. I have no idea for how long, at least an hour, maybe longer, thinking about my life, thinking about could there be a God, and if there were, could I know him? And I just called out to him. I didn't know any of the words. I'd never seen any brochures about evangelicalism. I never knew there was such a thing. I knew nothing about organized Christianity, except I'd once in a while been dragged to church as a kid. But that night, for the first time in my life, I was sure there was a God. And I was sure he was hearing me. I woke up the next morning figuring I was going to be embarrassed, and instead I couldn't wait to get my hands on Mere Christianity and read it from cover to cover. And I got out a yellow pad because I'm a lawyer, and I would have 2 columns. There is a God, there isn't a God. Jesus Christ is God, he isn't God. I went down that, and I went through the whole rational process, and I thought to myself, wow, I've never gone into a courtroom and argued against a mind like this. And so in the quiet of being off on the Maine coast, away from Watergate, before I was considered a target of the investigation, I simply quietly surrendered my life to Christ and asked him to come into my life. I will tell you, that's 35 years ago this past summer. Nothing about my life has been the same since. Nothing about my life can be the same again. It wasn't an emotional experience. It wasn't a one-time thing. I've been studying as deeply as I know how to study, as fervently as I know how to study. I am convinced Christ is who he says. I'm more convinced, as Malcolm Muggeridge once said, of the reality of Jesus Christ than I am of my own reality. And what that led me to, everybody has the happy ending for the Christian story, don't they? I mean, you live happily ever after. Everything turns out wonderfully in your life. Well, it's not true. C.S. Lewis also said, if you're looking for happiness, don't become a Christian. I recommend a bottle of port wine. And the reason is I got back to Washington and I realized I was guilty of some of these things. And then I started being hauled before the prosecutors, and I testified 44 times under oath. And one day I realized I got to put an end to this. And so I took the one thing, actually I took something that I hadn't been charged with, and walked into the prosecutors one day and I said, no deals, no bargains. This is something I did. I'll plead guilty. I want to get it behind me. Spent 1 to 7 months in prison. I want to tell you, if you want a culture shock, it is going from the office next to the President of the United States to a prison cell. And yet the most amazing thing in that prison, I'd see these men and my heart ached for them because they were lying on their bunk, staring into the nothingness, nothing to do, and their bodies atrophying and their souls corroding. Just a slow death. That's the horrible thing about doing time, as we inmates say. But I grew to love those guys. I was reading a little Bible study and had a passage in Hebrews which said God became lower than the angels for a period of time that he would not be ashamed to call us his brothers. I looked around at all these guys, drug dealers and murderers and bank robbers and all kinds of people, and I thought to myself, I'm no better than they are. I really got to love them. We got a little Bible study at night. There were 7 of us. There were 3 convicted dope thieves, a swindler, a car thief, a moonshiner, and former special counsel of the President of the United States. We'd be on our knees praying, and I really had a great relationship. I discovered in prison, away from all that power, the trappings of power, away from all the distractions in our culture, when you come face to face with yourself and God, that you find that which eludes you through life when you're seeking all the things of the world. And that's the paradox, and that's what I meant when I said that at the Australian press conference. You seek to save your life, you lose it. You lose your life for Christ's sake, you find it. And that's exactly the experience I had. Great paradox. But there's a second paradox, just like it, not unlike it. Second paradox is this. When you think everything is broken and gone in your life, as I did, there I am in prison, and I had opportunities. I wasn't disbarred in my home state. I could go back and practice law. And I got along in prison. I'd been in the Marines. I know how to handle myself in that environment. Life threatened it once seriously, but I managed it. That wasn't the tough part. Being separated from my family, that's tough. The tough part was realizing that all my life I'd been idealistic as a kid. I'd wanted to get ahead because I wanted to serve my country. I wanted to do something important. I wanted to change the world. I wanted to make this a better world to live in. I wanted to contribute to that. I was very idealistic. That meant much more to me than making money. And I realized I'll never have that chance again. Disgraced politician, public enemy number one, butt of all the jokes and ridicule, particularly when my conversion became public and everybody was mocking it. It was front page news every day for a year in the middle of Watergate. Commentaries on the news networks night after night. Chuck Colson improbably has become a Christian. I realized I'm never going to be able to do something significant or important in my life again. Don't ever underestimate God. I got out of prison and realized I had many offers. I had some good offers, as a matter of fact. A man flew from Texas and said, I'll put $1 million in your capital account after 1 year if you'll come in and work with me. I had all kinds of opportunities. But I decided that I'd been in prison for a purpose, that God wanted me to be back in the prison, and so I started going back in. And from those very, very modest beginnings, I took the first book royalties that I earned when the book I sold and put them into this ministry to get it started. From those very humble beginnings has come a ministry today that runs 10 prisons in America as Christian prisons as models, getting a phenomenal recidivism rate, phenomenal success. We have 50,000 volunteers around America, and the ministry has spread to 113 countries of the world. And every Christmas we deliver gifts to children whose parents are imprisoned. 500,000 kids a year. We've been doing this since 1982. Incredible things happening, none of which I planned. You got to believe me. I'm a pretty good strategist. I knew how to plan things. I didn't plan this. I thought, okay, God, if you want to take me and use me in the prisons, you take me and use me in the prisons. And he did far more with my life out of my brokenness and out of my weakness than I'd ever been able to do with my life out of my own power and influence and abilities. So what are the lessons? 2. What I've learned, at least, is this, that, and I say this to all of you as students here at this great university, and if you're half as smart as Cy, this is a very impressive room full of intellect. Use the gifts you have and the good minds you have that got you into an institution like this to work hard, to learn, to succeed, to make good in your life, to do everything that you can to get ahead and to be successful, caring for other people in the process, I would hope. But remember that no matter how good what you do is, what God will do through you if you give him that opportunity is far greater. And the second lesson I've learned is that while my experience might sound interesting to you, I had lunch with Larry King one day because he said to me, I want to know about God. And he said, I'm fascinated by you. So we sat down across at lunch and I went through all my experience, what had happened to me. And when I told him my experience as a Christian, he said, yeah, I've got a friend out in California who had an experience just like yours. She got into crystals and it changed her life too. And I had to come back and use a lot of other arguments to get to Larry King. So many of you are sitting there thinking, well, this is all well and good this happened to Chuck Colson, but is it true? Veritas, the name of this forum, which is also the motto of Harvard in the middle of the Harvard seal, means truth. And I believe that the Christian worldview is true. It is the only truth, the only worldview or philosophy or ideology, however you choose to call it, that is true. What's truth? Truth is that which conforms to reality, the way things are. I believe there's empirical evidence. There's many ways to know that there is truth, and that's something that I hope I'll be provocative enough to inspire questions about during the course of the evening, because it's a big issue. On every single campus, it's a big issue in America. But truth is that which conforms to the way things really are. It's reality. And how do you tell that when it comes to a religious belief system? You tell it by looking at all the belief systems that you wish to compare, whether it's naturalism, whether it's Islam, whether it's Eastern religions or New Age, or whether it's Marxism, They're all worldviews. They all are efforts to explain reality. They're all efforts to make a clear case for how life should be lived. That's what ideologies and religions come down to. And they all answer four basic questions. Any worldview will answer four questions. And all of you have thought about this and answered these questions. And all philosophers from the beginning of time have thought about these and answered these questions. Where did we come from? Why is there sin and suffering? Is there any way out? Is there any redemption in life? Marx said, workers arise, throw off your chains, you'll be redeemed. Sexual liberation is a form of redemption through releasing all of your inhibitions, the Freudian view of life. So that's the third question. And the fourth question is simply, what's our purpose? Now, the scientific method, which I'm sure you're familiar with and worked on in your classes, the scientific method says you take a proposition that's inductive reasoning, you take a proposition and you eliminate what it isn't, and what it isn't, what's left is what it is. That's very rough. People studying science can improve on that a lot here, I'm sure, but that's basically what you're doing. Well, I say that in ideologies and views of life, you do exactly the same thing. You say, how does Christianity work out answering those four questions? How does naturalism work out answering those four questions, or materialism? How does Islam work out answering those four questions? And once you do that, and there's a great classic theologian in the Christian tradition by the name of Cornelius Van Til, who used to do this. He would say, I'll start arguing that the only formulation for life that is rational is the Christian formulation. That's my presupposition. And I will show you that any other formulation is irrational. Well, let me just take 4 or 5 points very quickly. My experiences of what I've seen. I've been going into prisons now for 33 years, and I want to tell you how I've seen the Christian worldview work out in prisons, where there are 2.3 million people today in America, 1 out of every 100 adults, as opposed to all the other formulations of life and worldviews that one sees in prison. I'd like to talk to you about justice, because justice is the threshold question for any society. What is justice was Plato's first question, for which he wrote the Republic and never really gave it an adequate answer. But the Greeks say it's every person getting his due. The problem is modern liberals say today, and liberals always have said, that each person getting his due is to distribute to him what he's due. And the conservative says each person getting his due is when he steps out of line, which is what the caseworker said to me when I arrived in prison. He said, Colson, you're here for one reason: punishment. Not bad. He was right. So the conservative view is retribution, and the liberal view is distribution, so that each person gets his due. Interesting thing about the biblical worldview of justice. Biblical view of justice, if you read the Old Testament, contains book after book after book of social justice. It also respects private property. It also talks about punishing people when they do wrong. Interestingly enough, not with prisons in the Old Testament or the New Testament. That's a relatively modern invention. But with a form of punishment as retribution. So the interesting thing is that the biblical worldview embraces both, which we argue about. All the great arguments in America about justice are between the distributive or the retributive models. The Bible embraces both in balance. And it adds something. It adds shalom. Have you heard Jews talk to one another? Shalom? It's a greeting almost. It means peace, right? No, it means something much, much deeper. It means concord and harmony in a community relationship in which people can live together in love and care for one another. That's what shalom means. It means human flourishing, which is the theme that I find throughout the Bible, that we are concerned about people who are made in the image of God because we want human flourishing to exist. I've studied the justice systems of every other belief system, and none of them balance that way. None of them. Islam, if you commit a crime, your hand's chopped off. You won't do it again. Can't. Your hand's gone. The only one that is filled with grace and seeks restoration is the Christian view of justice. Then the question comes, why do I go into prisons? A lot of people ask me that. I've been asked that for the last 33 years since I started going in. They say, why are you going into prisons? And somebody wanted me to work with, I'd known most of the politicians and knew a lot of the world leaders in politics. And so people said to me, why don't you work in the ministry among leaders of governments? I said, because God's called me to the prisons. Why? Because they're neglected. And why do I care about that? Because I firmly believe, as the answer to the first question you ask about where we come from, that we were created by God in His image. The imago Dei, the image of God, is in every single human being, regardless of color, stage of his life, degree of dependency, regardless of his country of origin. The image of God is in every single person. And so I go into those prisons to this day loving those men because they're God's image bearers. A secular naturalist might really be very interested in prisons as a matter of policy, and they do some very good things. But I don't see them in holding people in their arms while they're dying of AIDS, which I've done many times in prison. And I say that not to bring any credit to myself. It's simply that if you are a Christian, you believe that every human being is made in the image of God. That's why I've been involved in every single human rights campaign over the last 15 years in Washington, every one. Sudan, Darfur, North Korea, wherever the human sexual trafficking, I've been involved in every one of those because every human being is created in the image of God. Jews believe that, but no other religious system does. If you look inside the prison, you ask yourself, what is going to solve the problem of these men? When I started working in the prisons, I was getting volunteers as fast as I could to start Bible studies in prisons all over America. First 3 or 4 years out, we were really working hard. And then I sat back one day and I realized they're building prisons faster than I can get to them. When I got out of prison, there were 229,000 people incarcerated in America. Today, tenfold, 2.3 million, as I mentioned earlier. So I thought to myself, I got to figure out why people are going to prison. Why is this so much? Why is this? Why the richest, most powerful nation in the world, we're incarcerating so many people? So I'm back and did a really lengthy study of the various sociological theories going back into the beginning of our country when the Quakers started the first prison in the Walnut Street Jail in Philadelphia. And I discovered that the prevailing view of sociologists was represented by Edwin Sunderland of Indiana University, which was the dominant view in the early part of the 20th century, and that is crime is caused by environment, deprivation, economics, people don't have a good chance, they get beaten down in life, it's their environment. And I questioned that because I was thinking to myself, I think people are responsible for their behavior. I came across a study, a 17-year longitudinal study done at St. Elizabeth's Hospital by 2 Jewish doctors, one a psychiatrist, one a psychologist, Professor Dr. Samanow and Colson. 17-year longitudinal study which found that the cause of crime was not, as they had presupposed when they began the study, was not environment or poverty or deprivation or racism. It was, as they put it, and this is their words, quote, individuals making wrong moral choices. They went on to say, therefore, the answer to crime is the conversion of the wrongdoer. That's their word, the conversion of the wrongdoer to a more responsible lifestyle. And I go into prisons every day. You want to talk about redemption? I go into prisons, not every day anymore, but I've been in hundreds and hundreds of prisons in 50 countries of the world. I've seen the same thing everywhere. Just this spring, a gang leader, muscular, tattooed, hairy arms, in solitary confinement because he was too dangerous to let out in the general population. This spring I met him. This happened 2 or 3 years ago. His name is Rick Vasquez, Hispanic. And in that cell, he had a Bible, but he used the Bible to tear the pages out and roll them for cigarettes. And one day before he started rolling the pages, he read some parts of it. And as he read it, he cried out to God. He said, God, save me. I want to know you. I want to be I want to be free. I want to be yours. And that man was converted, and that man was discipled by our people who work in that prison. That man had 2 more years in prison. He led half the gang members to Christ. Changed the prison he was in. Then we got him in one of our prisons where he worked for another year, and now he's out of prison, pastor of a Hispanic church in Houston, bringing in 10 or 12 ex-offenders out of the prisons every month into his church. That's hard to argue with. When you see that over and over and over again, that's empirical evidence that something does happen to those persons to convert them from one lifestyle to another and to live a different way. And it is the only answer we've found in crime. We run a prison in Texas that was started in 1996 in Houston, outside of Houston. And it has been operating, so we've been able to measure the results of the inmates getting out. University of Pennsylvania came down, did a peer-reviewed study at Harvard and Princeton, and found that the recidivism rate was 20% in a control group, 60% nationally, 8% among graduates of our program who went on and had mentors. I say there's empirical evidence that conversions are real. Now, Dawkins may say that's a delusion, but it's a delusion that has an incredible power in a person's life. And finally, purpose. I have to say purpose is so important. The thing you think most about in life is, what's my purpose? Why am I here? What am I supposed to be doing? And the wonderful thing about the Christian worldview is that we have a purpose, which is to try to restore and to redeem God's fallen creation. We say fallen creation because we believe original sin caused not only individuals to fall or be disposed towards sin, but the creation as well groans, awaiting the return of Christ. And what we've seen is when inmates get out of prison, I saw the toughest inmate who was in the Washington State prison system. He'd been known in California as the most incorrigible inmate in the state of California. I met him when I was in the Walla Walla prison in the state of Washington when it was about to erupt in a riot because the inmates were rioting over the fact they'd been locked in their cells for 9 months because 10 guards had been murdered over a 12-month period. It was the most brutal place I've been in my life. And I came into a room just much like this, only in a prison, and about the same number of people, a few hundred, scattered around the room. No guards came in. One guard came in, but he took his jacket off, so he wasn't on duty. And I talked to these guys about what had happened to me in prison. I talked to them about what Christ could mean to them. And the big guy sitting down front, the toughest of the tough, looked at me, and he came up to me afterwards, and he said, "I think you're for real." He slammed me on the back. I was glad he thought I was for real. And he said, "Would you come in here and help us?" And so we did. We started going in that prison. He was converted. His name was Don Dennis. He was converted when he was released from prison. He came with us, and he spent 10 years before he died working with kids on the streets of Dallas, Texas. That's purpose. That's something worth getting up for in the morning. That gives us a reason for living, because something, somehow, some way, each day I might be able to advance the kingdom and serve Christ's calling. So I would argue, and I've done this, and I have a teaching course that actually lasts almost a year of people who go through it. The Centurion, Cy knows all of what I do. And what we teach is looking at those 4 questions and how everyone answers them and how it works out in life. And I've come away, this is a very provocative statement with which I will close, but I hope it will provoke good questions and conversation. I've come away absolutely convinced that Van Til, all those years ago, was correct. Everybody starts life with a presupposition, because we don't know how life began. We don't know how the earth began. We make a presupposition. We work backwards with Darwin's theory, or we start with the presupposition God is. I would argue that the presupposition God is the most rational, because when you take the consequences of it, play it out in life, and empirically measure those consequences, one form of life works. It's not true because it works because it is true. God bless you.
Well, Chuck, I'd like to welcome you again to Columbia University. Your words were inspiring to a non-believer as well as many believers out there. One of the things that's great about your story is it is a true conversion. To give the young people in the audience a sense of where you were and where you got, can you talk a little bit about your days in the Nixon White House as the Hatchet Man?
Sure. It was a very difficult time. You've read about it in your history books, I suspect, because when Nixon was elected, there was a very unpopular war. Then at its height, 535,000 American troops on the ground in a mud hole war in Vietnam, unwinnable. And we walked into the White House with the Johnson administration having cleaned out everything. We couldn't find files, couldn't find toilet paper. They'd taken everything with them. So we were really starting from scratch. The public attitudes were really anti. The 60s was, I've called it the slum of the decade, because students were revolting against all forms of authority, and we become the new authority. Nixon was a conservative, which added fuel to the fire, and had a healthy dislike and distrust of the press, added fuel to the fire. The Washington Post, Sally Quinn, who's still around, wrote an article saying the Nixon administration coming to Washington is like the Nazis occupying Paris. So we didn't feel particularly welcome. There was a siege mentality from day one because there were demonstrators in the streets. I went home one night. I had an Army sergeant who drove my car and had to go around a gasoline can that had been thrown. A flaming can would have gone under our car. Many times I slept in my office because the 250,000 protesters around the White House. It was a very tough environment, and Nixon was a very tough guy. The reason that early on in our relationship, I'd known him in the 50s when he was vice president and I was administrative assistant to a United States senator, and he and I liked each other. I liked him because he had an uncommon intellect and a remarkable vision for peace, Quaker upbringing, and peace at the center. It was very, very deep with him. He also was Machiavellian and liked world politics because you could maneuver people, and he enjoyed that. And it was a very demanding place. When I was hired by the president, my good friend who was there ahead of me, who'd been with President Eisenhower, said, "Chuck, one thing you got to remember in this White House, wherever you go, walk with your back to the wall." It was a place where there wasn't a lot of camaraderie. There was a lot of competition and rivalry. Kissinger was a really difficult guy to work with and deal with. So it was a tough place. We were being attacked bitterly, and we developed our own form of what I called in my book hubris. We were to rise above it by our own power. Nixon wasn't above political dirty tricks, which all came out in the Watergate hearings. You can read about them. We didn't particularly invent them.
You were involved in compiling the enemies list, right?
No, actually, I wasn't, David. That's the public myth, and it came out later that John Dean said he enjoyed watching everybody try to wiggle off the hook. I hadn't. I had a list of people who would be invited to events and a list of people who wouldn't be invited to events. Mm-hmm. The actual enemies list that was delivered to the IRS just last year,
this was a list of, just for the historical background, the list of enemies of the Nixon administration.
Yeah, there were 13 people on the list, the enemies of the Nixon administration, which were delivered to the director of the IRS for investigation. That's clearly an abuse of power. It wasn't that I was above it. I just didn't happen to be the one who did that.
So what were the dirty tricks that you were involved in?
Oh, I would get phony committees organized to embarrass the other side. I had the job of coercing the networks from time to time, gently.
What do you mean by
coercing
gently?
Well, get them in and talk to them and hint about their licenses. I went to New York and visited them. It was tough politics. It was politics, bare-knuckle politics, no question about it. And Nixon always bragged about me. He said, "Chuck Colson's the guy that'll walk through any door without opening it." So, and I'd been a Marine infantry captain, so I had the tough guy image. A lot of it became glamorous. I never said I'd run over my own grandmother. But that'll be on my tombstone, because everywhere I go, it's amazing. Everywhere I go around the world, people say, "You're the one that said you'd run over your own grandmother." I never did. It was said about me in a profile where I wouldn't give an interview to the reporter, and he interviewed someone who worked for me on the Hill, Capitol Hill, the Congress, who said wonderfully nice things about me, and then said, "But be careful, he's so tough he'd run over his own grandmother." 3 weeks later, it appeared in the press saying Chuck Colson, who boasted he'd run over his own grandmother. So much of it was true, but the public, what happens to people in public life is a stereotype. A legend builds up around them, and you can never change it because it becomes part of the folklore.
But you were admittedly doing things that were wrong, morally wrong when you were.
Well, I would look back on most of them now and say, yeah, I would say at the time I said they were politically tough. You had to do the dirty work the president asked you to do. I never felt I stepped over the line on anything politically. Ethically, yeah, I did. I was the guy doing the president's bidding on a lot of the stuff that he did.
How did that happen? Here you're a lawyer, and you get into the White House, and now you're doing stuff that is unethical, intimidating, TV stations, stuff you went to prison for.
Oh, that's not what I went to prison for, but I
no, I know,
but I should have.
But the abuse of power stuff,
right?
You know, you're doing. How does that happen? How does that happen to a young lawyer?
Well, it happens to anybody when they lose sight of, when they don't take time to reflect, is this right, intrinsically right, or is this wrong? And there were times when I sat in President Nixon's office, I've written about this, when the president said, you got to remember in the Ellsberg case, that won't mean anything to you, but there was a man by the name of Daniel Ellsberg who stole the Pentagon Papers and released them to the press, sent a copy to the Russian embassy.
The Pentagon Papers were a secret study by the Pentagon of how the United States got involved
into Vietnam. It all reflected on the administration before us, but it had names of CIA operatives. It had a lot of things in it that were genuinely national security. And Henry Kissinger, one day, I was with him in the room when he was smoking, fuming. We can't have any foreign policy if these documents are released. So when Nixon was sitting in the office one night, and I was there with two other aides, and the president turned to one of them, Bob Haldeman, and he said, "I've told you before, I want a team that will break into those places and get those documents back. Why don't we have that here?" Haldeman said, "That's the FBI's job," and which the FBI did do those things in those days. Eventually, they hired some people to do it. I was sitting there as a lawyer who had graduated at the top of my law school class. I should have been smart enough to say, "Hey, Mr. President, that's illegal if you do it."
Now, it's said that the Pentagon Papers, one copy was in the Brookings Institute, and it said that you came up with the idea of starting a fire in the Brookings Institute so you could get in, so you could get a team in there while they were busy putting down the fire.
That was the idea of a New York cop by the name of Jack Caulfield, which I rejected, and he later recanted his testimony and said he had not told the truth.
So that wasn't true. That was not your idea.
It wasn't my idea, but
so were you guilty of anything, Chuck? I mean, it doesn't really sound like you did much.
I didn't know about the Watergate break-in either, but let me tell you, it's a very fine distinction, because it wasn't that I objected to these things as I should have morally. It was that I was part of the culture which we built, which was a macho, tough guy culture of hubris, and so I deserved whatever they called me. The specifics you happen to be pulling out have been pretty much debunked over the years, but it doesn't matter. The perception is there, and it reflected a certain reality. I mean, I will confess I was the White House tough guy. I don't mind admitting it. I could not go back and live that way now, I don't think. I hope I couldn't.
Now, of course, your story of getting into the White House or getting into politics and having it shape your morality in a bad way, it's not unusual. I mean, it happens to so many. I'm sure there are a lot of young students out there who are good Christians. They want to live a moral life, but they also want to get into politics. Is it possible to reconcile the two?
Yes, it is. I know a lot of people in politics. I think of several very good friends of mine who have kept their integrity absolutely. Former governor of Minnesota, one of my closest friends, his name was Al Quie, You could not corrupt al-Qu'i even in his thought life. I mean, he's just a rock of integrity. I could take you through the Congress now, the numbers, I will say, are getting less each year, and they're getting less each year because of the influence of big money in politics. Because a lot of the congressmen get elected and then immediately start making phone calls to raise money. And the special interests that should have been curtailed years ago are fatter and more powerful today than they've ever been. So it's harder in politics today. My good friends who are in it, whom I love and respect, they're strong Christians. They keep their witness clear, but they're under huge pressure. And many of them leave because they can't live with it.
What are the pitfalls,
it's
not just for
game,
politicians, but for anybody working in politics? What are the pitfalls in terms of the moral pitfalls?
Well, you begin to believe that you're so important, as I believe the president was so important, that you'll cut corners. The great rationalization politicians enter into is, yeah, I'm not telling the truth here completely. I am saying something that I know isn't true, but I can't do the good things I promised to do unless I get in power, and unless I say these things, I can't stay in power. That's really the compromise you make. Yeah. It's a Faustian bargain, but you've talked yourself into believing it's a good thing.
And that's true for staffers, too. I mean, I've worked on campaigns myself, and there are times when you just write something that is sort of true, but not entirely, because you get to the ends justify the means.
Yeah, I don't want to disillusion you from politics, because it really is a noble profession. And as a Christian, Calvin believed it was the highest calling for a person, apart from being in Christian service himself, the highest calling, highest vocation, because the magistrate is the one who administers justice and preserves order and restrains evil. So it'll be a very sad day in American life when good people stay away from politics. But it is a much tougher business than a lot of other ways to make life, although I suppose people on Wall Street have been through the ringer in the last year and have thought about a lot of things that they might have done differently if they thought about them over again. We all get caught up in, we're all products of a culture to a degree. We should resist that happening to us, but it's human nature to kind of go with the pack. And so that happens in every walk of life. When it happens in politics, it's front page news.
Mm-hmm. But politics is not unusual in terms of its corrupting factor?
No, I don't think so. And I was just reading an article recently about politics in the Jefferson-Adams campaign and the dirty politics and the charges and the dirty tricks. And sounded just like the Nixon years. Maybe it doesn't change that much.
In terms of the popular or the political discussion today, God plays a major role. This was not the case so much, morality and God, when you were working for Nixon. Is this a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, I think it's a very good thing, because I think that George Orwell, 1984, name familiar? Great writer, atheist. Before he died, he wrote a very trenchant paragraph or two in which he said, I look back on the tradition of the Western civilization, informed as it is by Judeo-Christian revelation, and realize as I look around us that we are all sitting on the branch, cutting off the limb on which we're sitting. And what I look at is not flowers and gentle flowers down below that I'm about to fall into, but thorns. And after a life of atheism and skepticism, he said he recognized that it's not possible to have a free society without a vibrant moral basis for that society. And a lot of scholars have said that through the years. I think it is demonstrably true. I think our founding fathers clearly had that in mind. I think Jefferson, who was not a Christian, he was a deist, and there's a difference if you're interested, but Jefferson was not a Christian when he said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, was talking about nature and nature's God. So I think there's always been a sense in free societies that you need the moral restraint.
But in the past two elections, whenever the discussion got to domestic affairs, It would be gay marriage, the abortion issue, as always. In 2000, Bill Clinton's morality and the morality of the presidency. And now we're faced with a huge economic disaster, which we should have seen coming. There should have been political discussion about this. Has morality become too much the focus of our political discussion? That gay marriage being a primary issue in 2004. Well, perhaps we should have been talking about banking.
Gay marriage is a critical question if you believe that in every civilized society, apart from what the Bible says, not even from a Christian standpoint, but every civilized society has recognized the uniqueness of the relationship of man and woman because it has been the foundation building block for raising children. And as Aristotle taught, character is formed in the family. So the preservation of the family is in society's self-interest. And I think that's not simply a fringe social issue. I think it's a central issue about how we live our lives together. But economics certainly is filled with moral questions. One of the great moral theologians of our day is a man by the name of Michael Novak, who's written The Spirit of Democratic Capitalism, I think an all-time classic, in which he argues that free Western liberal democracy rests on a three-legged stool: political freedom, economic freedom, moral restraint. Take one leg away and the stool collapses. I think what we're seeing today is we have taken away the leg of moral restraint, and political freedom and economic freedom without moral restraint leads to chaos. And I think that's part of the chaos in the marketplace. That's always been a discussion. That goes back to Lord Acton in England. The whole question of...
But yet what you're saying right
now Adam Smith was a moral theologian.
But right now, you don't... I mean, that is beautiful. But you don't hear politicians talk about the morality. Now it's just, corporate greed and that sort of thing. It's this kind of moralizing versus what you're talking about is it's in the interest of the society and for the economy to have morality.
I've argued that for years. I know a lot of politicians who have. John Paul II wrote a incredible encyclical about the subject when the Catholic Church went from 2,000 years of skepticism of free markets to embrace free markets. So I think it is part of the discussion. Maybe you don't hear it. You don't hear it.
You don't hear it tonight, for example.
Well, but you're the expert in the media as well. You know that the media doesn't pick up arcane subjects, and they would regard that as an arcane subject. An inflammatory subject is gay marriage. My goodness, you get everybody's passions aroused. What are you going to do when they start talking about the economics of the marketplace?
Do you think politicians just cater themselves to what is going to get on the TV?
Oh, well, you and I talked about that ahead of time. I think what gets on the tube shapes the political discussion. I was telling Professor that one of my favorite books is a book called The Political Illusion, written by a French theologian in the early 60s, who said eventually communication will become so pervasive that the instruments of communication will gravitate to the centers of power because the people in power will want to use it, and eventually there'll be nothing but a political message. And what will happen through that political message is that the public will get the idea that there are political solutions to all problems, and it will cause the deterioration and erosion of all the intermediate structures of society. And people today, political campaigns start the day after the one before it ends, and it's just continuous politics, and people think everything has to have a political solution. It doesn't. Most of the great things that happen in life happen because of the little platoons, as Edmund Burke called it, the little groups, the intermediate structures of society which go out and do the good works. That's what happens.
Like the good works, of course, that you're doing now, for example.
My good works, there are hundreds like it, thousands like it.
Right. We have a question here about Lee Atwater, another great media political mind, who also had a great conversion towards the last days of his life. But this question is skeptical about conversions like yourself and Lee Atwater. Why is it that they always seem to happen when you're out of power or you're out of the game in one way or the other?
Well, they don't, but the only ones you hear about are those that happen under dramatic circumstances. I meet people every day who've had very quiet conversions, and their life wasn't collapsing, but they realized it wasn't complete. They realized they couldn't answer the great questions about life. And they've heard the gospel, they've heard the good news that in Jesus Christ their sins are forgiven, and they can have a new life. And they choose to accept that and to follow that and become very serious disciples. You hear about the guys like me, the rascals, who are all over the newspapers, and suddenly now they're pious and religious. And so we're looked at with great suspicion, just like the Apostle Paul was, who was a persecutor of Christians. He was looked at with great suspicion, understandably so. And so was Lee Atwater, who was a very decent kid from South Carolina who was obsessed with politics. It was in his blood. He loved it the same way I did. We were very similar. He always said I was his model. Tragically, in his 30s, he got a brain tumor, and while in George Washington Hospital, a number of us spent time with him and helped him find a relationship with Christ before he died. And that gets publicity. But is it a conversion of convenience? It would certainly look that way. And if I was sitting there skeptical and somebody like me was sitting up here, I would think, boy, that was convenient timing. Save himself from going to prison. The problem is that's been 35 years ago. It didn't save me from going to prison. And I'm still doing what I started 33 years ago today. And if you think going in prisons is a pleasant thing to do as compared to fishing or golf or talking with your friends or having lunch in a cafe here in New York, let me disabuse you quickly. They're rotten, stinking holes. And I love going in them.
Why do you love going in?
I'd either be...
What is it about prisons that...
I got to be the greatest con man in the world or insane. Well, take your pick.
Yeah. Well, obviously you're not a con man, right? But what about the prisons? I mean, that of all things to have chosen.
Well, I was there.
Yeah.
And while I was in prison, there was a guy one night, we were sitting in the day room, and it was a life-changing experience because this big, tall guy stood up. He happened to be black, and there were a lot of racial tensions in this prison in Montgomery, Alabama. And he stood up and he said, "Hey, Colson." I was writing a letter home to my wife, and television's going, and card games. He had a deck of cards in his hands. He stood up and he was angry. I said, "Colson, what are you going to do for us when you get out of here?" I said, "Archie, I'll never forget you guys." He took the cards and he slammed them down. He said, "Ah, bull. Big shots like you come to our prison and you leave and you forget us." And that really haunted me. And I didn't want to forget him. And I started going back. I also didn't want to start a ministry because my wife didn't want to. But that was probably the last thing we wanted to do. We wanted nothing of public life. I still could practice law in my home state. I was preparing to go back and do that. And yet I kept going to the prison. And it took about a year when she finally said, "If this is what you want to do, we'll do it with our lives." And I've been doing it ever since. And why do I love it? I love it because it's a bracing dose of realism. Most of Christian activities are in nice churches. People dress up on Sundays. It's real in the prisons. And when I preach the gospel in the prisons, the guys really, really get it. Because you just imagine yourself. You're sitting in a cell. You got 20 more years to do on your sentence. Your family's left you. The best you can hope for is that you may get out of that place and be one of the lucky 40% who don't reoffend and come back into the prison. You've got nothing to look at but four walls of that prison cell. You may have a small television or television on the floor that you can see from your cell. And somebody comes in and talks to you about Jesus, who was a prisoner who died on the cross in between two thieves and came for people just like us, the losers of society, not the winners. Those guys really get that. I love to worship in the prisons. For those of you who are believers here, let me tell you, that's the most genuine Christianity you will ever run into. Everybody thinks it's jailhouse religion. It is not. They get persecuted. They get turned down for parole. When I pled guilty in the Watergate special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski, said to me, because my conversion came out, before I pled guilty, rather, my conversion came out in the press, and I was called in for questioning one night, and he said, "Yes, I know you've had one of those conversions." He said, "Now maybe you'll just tell us what you really did before the train gets out of the station and you can save your law license." He wanted me to confess to something I hadn't done. I didn't do it. But it hurt me. I mean, it's not a plus in prison to be a Christian. It takes guts. But, man, those guys are real. I love it.
Switching gears a little bit, During your speech, you mentioned, or you said, that Christianity is the truth, and the other religions are not true. Now, for a lot of the students, it seems that really struck a nerve. They are not used to anybody coming in and saying, Islam is false, Judaism is false. How can you say that?
Well, first of all, the wonderful thing about a free society and the wonderful thing about free religious choice is you're able to choose the truth claim you want. But every religion is by definition a truth claim. And a truth claim by definition is exclusive. If I say I can only be a Jew if I'm born into the line of David, into the covenant people, that's a truth claim. If Islam says you can only come to God if you swear your allegiance to Muhammad and you worship Allah, and you can't convert, because if you convert you're apostate and you can be killed, you can't leave it, that's a truth claim. The interesting thing about every religion, Hinduism, dream in the mind of God. If we're a dream in the mind of God, that's a truth claim. Everybody's got an explanation. Everybody's got a worldview. And if you look at the worldview of Marxism or Freudianism or any of the ideologies, you will see they all make truth claims. So there's nothing unique about Christianity. It makes a truth claim. Now, if I choose that to be true, then the opposite of it can't be true, because that violates the law of non-contradiction, which goes back a long way, Aristotle. And something cannot be of one substance that at the same time it's another substance. So it's nothing wrong with my saying that, and at the same time I say I fully respect your right to believe your truth claim. I'm not being bigoted, I'm not being offensive to you.
But are they wrong?
Well,
Jews,
if
for
I'm
example.
right, they are.
Right.
And if they're right, I'm wrong. But that's what free discourse is all about.
Well, I guess, so you just choose your own truth? Is that it?
No.
No.
I think one is going to be true because it's going to conform to reality. And that's why I say there are many ways you can know truth. You can know truth by natural revelation in creation around us. The Bible says people are an excuse. When you see the beauty of creation, you know that there was a creator. Truth is written on the human heart. There's a professor at Harvard now, Marcus, I think his name is, Mark Hauser, who has come out with a study of the brain, which says there's a portion of the brain that makes moral choices. And he said it seems to be written into every single human being. Well, the Bible says that the moral law is written on the human heart, whether you ever read the Bible or not.
But how do you explain then the horror of genocide, of Holocaust, of war?
That gets into a question of the genocide and the Holocaust. Certainly of the 20th century horrors, none of them belong to Christians. The 20th century
Christians
horrors
aren't guilty of any of those horrors, then.
Not of those horrors, not of genocide, or not of certainly the killing fields in Cambodia, not certainly of Stalin's Gulag, and not certainly of Hitler's
What about the
gas
Crusades?
chambers. Those are all secular horrors. Those are all people who rejected historic religion. I know the most offensive thing you can say is that I believe that my belief system is true, really true, in the sense that it can be proven to be true. And it requires faith to believe in God, but I think you can show by the evidence that one belief system more accurately corresponds with the way life is lived than another belief system. And I think that's a fair debate. And I respect your right to believe something else. Believe me, when I went in the Marines, I was perfectly prepared to give my life to protect religious freedom of all people, not just Christians. I wasn't a believer at the time. But I strongly believe that the great strength of this country is that we can all have our different truth claims and we can live together. It doesn't mean they're all right, because they can't all be right. They can all be wrong, but they can't all be right. But it means we can still live by them and have honest discourse between us, and maybe I can persuade you mine's right, and maybe you'll persuade me yours is right. But that's the wonderful thing about a free, open, tolerant society. That's tolerance. Tolerance
Right.
isn't dumbing down the
But at the
debate.
end of the day, it's the Christian God and the Christian truth that is the truth.
Or Yahweh and the Jewish God, or Allah, or the God of the universe that I find in myself, Shirley MacLaine. When Shirley MacLaine says, "I am God," she is making a truth claim. That's a pretty exclusive truth claim, I think. But that's what she says.
What about those who say there is no God?
That's a truth claim.
Are they right?
I don't think so.
Okay, right, all right.
But
No, I know that,
I'll
but-
fight to defend their right to believe that.
Right, of course. But they're wrong, right?
Sure.
Okay.
You study politics, for goodness sakes. Both sides can't be right.
Right.
When there are ideological battles going on in politics where there are loggerheads, you're not going to tell me that one who's arguing his position is offending the one who's arguing another position. That's part of argument.
In your
That's
opinion,
part of honest discourse.
Getting back to the politics then, should a president be a Christian?
We shouldn't choose a president because of his faith or lack of faith. Our Constitution is very specific that there is not a religious test.
Right.
And thank God it is. Nor does a Christian vote for a candidate simply because he is a Christian. What the Bible says is that the job of the magistrate is to preserve order and do justice. Jethro, when he gave advice to Moses, those of you who are Bible students here will remember that part in Genesis when Moses is about to take command of the people and his uncle Jethro comes and says, "You need to choose lieutenants, judges to help you govern. Choose men who are able and who have integrity, who reject dishonest gain." So I think the Christian looks at politics and says there are two qualifications: ability, integrity, and not faith. And Martin Luther very famously said, "I'd rather be governed by a Turk, which was a Muslim, than a competent Turk than an incompetent Christian." And I would say exactly the same thing. So I look at a person's integrity, and his faith commitment and the way he lives it faithfully is a sign of integrity. But it is not a test for me in voting.
But now, a president's job, in part, is to strike back at enemies. It is not to turn the other cheek when attacked. How does somebody actually reconcile Jesus' teachings with what is necessary to be president of the United States?
You're going to learn enough theology tonight, David, to become a Christian. The Lutherans deal with this as two kingdoms. You have two jobs, once when you're a magistrate and once in your personal views. The Beatitudes and the personal admonitions to Christians about how we live are the citizenship guides for the kingdom to come, which we try to live here as much as possible. But you live in the real world where you have to discharge the responsibilities of government, which often, Romans 13, the government wields the sword to protect the innocent, often means you have to not turn the other cheek, although you would do that personally. You do not do that in office. But that's an argument. I wrote a 600-page book called Kingdoms in Conflict, Now God and Government, in which I discussed all of these issues. And they're finely nuanced, but there is a responsibility, public responsibility, that a Christian accepts and has to act somewhat differently when he accepts it. But often would have to behave in a way that would be inconsistent for an individual Christian to act. That's the best way to put it.
You could appoint one single American president of the United States. Who would it be right now?
I don't know anybody I want to wish that job on. Certainly wouldn't be a friend. I would like to see someone take that job who would shake up the political order. The system has gotten so bad in the years since I've been in Washington, and the special interest powers so great, government so big and cumbersome that it can't get out of its own way, that I'd like to see somebody come in and say, how many of you saw the ad by Pete Peterson, his foundation, in the two-page ad in the New York Times 10 days ago, Sunday New York Times? Anybody see that? Pete Peterson has a foundation, Peter Peterson Foundation. Go look it up on the website. It's really fascinating. Pete Peterson's an interesting man. He was young. I think his parents were Greek immigrants. He started out with nothing. I knew him when he was an assistant to President Nixon, and I was an assistant, and we were friends. And then he became Secretary of Commerce, and then he went off to the Blackstone enterprise and made billions. He's now running a group. The ad showed all of the obligations of the United States government, all the unfunded liabilities, and then the total debt of each American citizen for all those unfunded liabilities. Then all the possible income that would come if you ended both the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, if you repealed all the Bush tax cuts, if you raised the income taxes, and it comes to about 15% of the liabilities. If you're studying business or you end up in business, you're going to discover that if that happened to your business, you'd declare bankruptcy. You'd go to Chapter 10 and reorganize. I think somebody has to come in and clean the system out, because the system has lost its capacity to correct itself. The political system, they had to do this with base closings, because nobody could ever close a military base because it was in some congressman's district.
Chuck, what went wrong? You had
Somebody's
a Republican
got to do this.
In the administration for 4 years. You had a Republican Congress. What happened to the Republican Party on this one?
They got as badly corrupted as the Democrats had been before them. They took over the system and said, we're going to clean it up, and they made it worse.
Is that just then inevitable, right? The Republicans are going to get clobbered this election, right? Obama is probably going to win. Is it inevitable that the Democrats are going to come in and then they're going to become the pigs at the trough? Yeah. So what is there any solution to break this cycle?
Well, that's why I like Peterson's recommendation. He says there should be a SAFE, S-A-F-E, a commission, bipartisan, some of the real sages of American life, some of the real wise men and women of American life, and say, here are the things we can do, here are the things we can't do. Up or down vote in the Congress, no amendments. And they did that with the military bases, and it worked. I don't see anything short of that. I've just done a radio broadcast about that, because I think the system has such built-in flaws that it's lost its capacity of self-correction. So it has to collapse. I think that's a little bit of what's happening to us in the markets today.
Do you think that this is going to be big enough that it will shake the foundation so much that real reform is possible now?
That's the only way it'll happen. And I think there's a very good likelihood that it will over the next few years.
And what part would Christianity or religion play in that kind of reform?
Well, Christianity ought to be always playing a part in civil life, because Christianity is not just simply a relationship with Jesus Christ. That's how you become a Christian, but that's not what Christianity is about. Christianity is a worldview. In the Gospel according to St. John, when he uses the word logos, the Greek word is logos, when he says the word the word was with God, the word was God, word became flesh and dwelt among us. Word is logos. Logos to the Greek, and St. John was a Greek, logos meant all truth that could ever be known. It's everything. And so Christians are concerned with arts and music and science and literature and politics and neighborhoods and families. I mean, Christianity is a way of seeing all of life. So if there's going to be a major realignment in American life, I would hope that Christian influence would be brought to bear, not in a theocratic sense, because I believe in free will above all else, and free pluralistic societies above all else, but in a way in which we can contribute. I've addressed over half the state legislatures in America on criminal justice reform, and I've said to them, if you'd give me the authority to do it, I'd cut your prison population in half and put the half I let out to work, and you'd never have a dent in your crime rate. And in 99% of the cases, they've come up to me afterwards and said, you're absolutely right, but the public won't let us do it. We wouldn't get reelected if we did that. Should have work programs instead of incarceration for non-dangerous offenders. It's crazy. We build institutions, spends $24,000 a year keeping a person in prison, costs $100,000 a cell, and half of them are non-dangerous. So
Chuck,
do better things.
What advice would you have, last question, to these young students here who are looking to begin their adult lives living a Christian life, on how they can make a difference?
The great myth which Christianity explodes is that you have to be significant and important and an influential position to do great things. I told you there were 2 lessons out of my talk tonight. Number 1, work hard, achieve, be successful, do the best you can. Remember, however, that God can do through you far more than you can do on your own. And if you set out and really trust the Lord, there's a great deal you can do to change the community around you. One thing Christians have been so good at. I'll give you a good example. Martin Luther King. He was a community activist who quoted the Bible in public debate, read the book of Amos to crowds. Last time anybody in American public life has read the Bible as his defense for what he did, and wrote the letters from the Birmingham jail in which he defended his civil disobedience on the grounds that it was an unjust law, was no law at all, and he cited Augustine and Aquinas. And he made a profound difference. If you're wise about the way in which you prudentially talk about your Christian faith, you can make a great difference in places. I just finished a TV debate with Peter Singer at Princeton, who's rather an extreme utilitarian, believes in infanticide and euthanasia. Our debate was not toe-to-toe debate. Our debate was, he was interviewed, I was interviewed separately, but same questions. And one of the things he says is, Christianity has different views about this, but that should be debated in the faith community. And outside the faith community, it's pure reason. Well, that's a false dichotomy, and I tried to answer that in the questions. But, having said that, I could argue with him for 2 hours, toe-to-toe, and never once mention the Bible. Because I'd simply talk about the history of civilized societies, which have viewed the job of government to protect life as being part of its contract with the people. So you take prudential arguments. So do something in an area where you feel inspired to do it. Don't be a spectator. Get involved. You will have I met a guy in the airport today flying up here. He said, I got involved in your ministry, and he said, boy, he said, we had a great time with the inmates, but a real blessing for me. He said, changed my life. When you get out and do something to help other people, it changes your life. And don't ever be intimidated and think you don't have an influence or power. You do. And great movements start from the bottom up, never from the top down. Nesbitt said, fads start from the top down, movements start from the bottom up. And Wesley's movement, all the great movements in history, spiritual movements, have been from the bottom up. So, take an interest in your own church, get involved in some little platoon activity, I call it, in society, doing some good for other people. Take your gifts wherever they can be applied and use them, and be winsome with your neighbors. That's the best thing you can do as Christians leaving here.
All right. Thank you very much, Chuck.
Thank you, Vanessa.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at www.veritas.org.